The Brooklyn rain felt like ice needles against my skin as I stood on the sidewalk of Jefferson Avenue. I had just spent 10 days in Atlanta settling the final details of my father's headstone and handling a grueling business consultation. My body ached with a fatigue that went deeper than my bones. I was 52 years old, and all I wanted was to step into the warmth of the 3-story brownstone that my father Elijah had painstakingly restored with his own 2 hands. This house was more than real estate. It was our fortress and our history. I gripped my brass key and stepped up the sandstone stairs, bracing myself for the hollow silence that had filled the halls since Pop passed away. I inserted the key into the heavy oak door, but it would not turn. I tried again, pushing with my shoulder, thinking the humidity had swollen the wood. It was then that I realized the cylinder was brand new and shining with a silver finish that did not match the original hardware. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I turned around and looked toward the curb, where a mountain of black plastic garbage bags sat slumped in the rising water of the gutter. One bag had split open near the top. I saw the distinctive colorful corner of a cardboard sleeve. My breath hitched as I knelt in the rain. It was my father's prized collection of jazz vinyl records. I reached out and pulled one out, only to find the thick black disc snapped into 4 jagged pieces. These were the albums he played every Sunday morning while he cooked grits and bacon. Next to the records, my professional drafting tubes were crushed and half submerged in a puddle. My architectural drawings, years of work on historical preservation projects, were nothing but gray pulp now. The sound of a sliding glass door overhead made me look up. Genevieve, my stepmother, stood on the second-floor balcony. She was wearing a silk robe that my father had bought her, and she held a glass of expensive Merlot in her hand. Beside her stood Portia, her daughter, who was busy recording the scene on her phone with a smirk on her face. Genevieve looked down at me with a gaze that held no pity. She told me in a sharp voice that she had changed the locks because the house had been sold. She said I no longer had a place there and that my dusty old trash did not belong in a luxury residence. I did not scream. I did not beg or cry. I stood up slowly and wiped the rainwater from my face, feeling a freezing wall of cold fury settle over my heart. I looked at the broken records and then back at the woman who had spent 10 years pretending to love my father. I knew something she did not know. I knew the secrets buried in the trust documents and the trap my father had set for exactly this moment. I simply stared at her until her smirk began to fade into a look of discomfort. The battle had begun, but I would be the one to finish it. The front door creaked open and Darius stepped out onto the landing with a swagger that made my skin crawl. He was wearing a slim-fit navy suit that cost more than his character was worth, and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine that felt out of place against the grit of the Brooklyn rain. Darius was a young real estate broker who saw the world in commission checks rather than community history. He leaned against the doorframe of my father's house and flashed a smile that was as bright and hollow as a fluorescent bulb. He looked at me and confirmed that he was the one who had purchased the property from Genevieve for $600,000. I knew the market value was at least $2,500,000, but Darius clearly thought he had pulled off the heist of the century. He looked at the brownstone with a greedy glint in his eyes and told me that the neighborhood was finally changing for the better. He said that people like me were stuck in the past and that he planned to gut the entire interior. He described how he would tear down the dark mahogany walls and replace them with bright white drywall and open concepts to attract the new wealthy buyers moving into Bed-Stuy. He called it an upgrade and a necessary evolution for a house that he considered a relic. To him, my father's craftsmanship was just a barrier to profit. Then he did something that made the air vanish from my lungs. He stepped down to the sidewalk and casually kicked a pile of my father's jazz records with his expensive leather shoe. He laughed as the broken vinyl skidded across the wet pavement. He said that this old junk was the first thing to go, and that there was no room for sentimental trash in a luxury development. It was a direct insult to the man who had built this life for us. I did not raise my voice or reach out to strike him. I simply knelt in the rain and picked up a jagged piece of a Duke Ellington record that my father had cherished for over 40 years. I stood up and looked Darius directly in his eyes, holding his gaze with a terrifying stillness. I told him that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. I saw a flicker of confusion cross his face as I turned my back on them and walked away into the storm. They watched me leave, standing in the doorway of a house they did not yet realize was a cage of their own making. The memory of my meeting with Attorney Thurgood washed over me like a calm tide in the middle of the storm. It had happened only 5 days after the funeral, in a quiet office filled with the scent of old leather and tobacco. Thurgood was a tall man with silver hair, who had been my father's closest friend for over 40 years. He sat behind a massive oak desk and looked at me with eyes that held a lifetime of legal wisdom. He did not offer empty platitudes about grief. Instead, he reached into a thick manila folder and pulled out a document that would change everything. He told me that my father Elijah had been much sharper than Genevieve ever realized. 5 years ago, when the first shadows of forgetfulness began to touch his mind, my father had taken a decisive step to protect his legacy. He had transferred the entire ownership of the brownstone into an irrevocable trust. I was named as the sole trustee and the only beneficiary. Thurgood explained the legal reality that Genevieve was too arrogant to investigate. She did not own a single brick of that house. She had been granted what the law calls a life estate, which meant she had the right to live there until her passing. But that right came with heavy chains. My father had inserted a specific poison pill provision into the trust. If the resident ever attempted to sell the property, took out a mortgage against it, or intentionally damaged the structural integrity and original character of the home, her right to reside there would terminate instantly. I had jumped to my feet ready to call the police and throw her out that very afternoon. I wanted her to feel the weight of her betrayal immediately. But Thurgood held up a steady hand and told me to sit down. He told me to wait. He explained that Darius was a man driven by a hungry, reckless greed. He knew that Darius would not be content simply living in the house. He would want to flip it, to gut it, and to erase my father's touch to make a quick profit. Thurgood advised me to let them believe they had won for a moment. He said that the moment Darius swung his first sledgehammer against those historic walls, he would be committing a criminal act of destruction against the property of the trust. By allowing them to proceed, I was not being weak. I was giving them enough rope to hang themselves. Thurgood told me that we would not just win a house back, we would ensure they lost everything they valued. I understood then that my silence was my greatest weapon. I found sanctuary across the street at the home of Mr. Otis, a man who had lived on this block for 60 years and remembered when the trees were just saplings. He was the unofficial guardian of our neighborhood history, and he had watched me grow from a child playing on the stoop into the woman I am today. Sitting in his darkened parlor, I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. I spent my days positioned by his front window, watching through the lace curtains, as my family home was treated like a common piece of meat. Darius had wasted no time in marking his territory. He had hired a crew to hang a massive gaudy banner across the parlor floor windows that shouted, "Coming soon luxury condos," in bold gold lettering. Every time I saw that sign, it felt like a physical blow to my chest. The internal conflict was a constant storm inside me. It took every ounce of my will not to run across the street and scream at the strangers who were trampling through the rooms where my father had lived and breathed. I saw people carrying out pieces of our life as if they were nothing but debris. However, I remained patient and channeled my grief into a cold, meticulous documentation of their downfall. I set up a high-powered camera with a long zoom lens on a tripod, and I used a small, silent flycam drone to capture angles they never suspected. I recorded every face, every vehicle, and every box that entered or exited the premises. The situation escalated quickly as I began to notice a pattern in their movements. Large trucks arrived late in the evening or very early in the morning to drop off cheap lumber and industrial supplies. I watched carefully for the one thing that should have been there but was missing. There were no city inspectors and no official work permits posted in the front window as required by law. Darius was taking a dangerous shortcut. He was hiring unlicensed day laborers and working off the books to save money and avoid the scrutiny of the building department. He thought he was being clever by bypassing the system, but he was actually walking straight into the trap Attorney Thurgood and I had discussed. This was the exact opportunity I had been waiting for. By avoiding the official channels, Darius was not just being greedy, he was making himself a criminal. I sat in the shadows of Mr. Otis's house and kept the record button running, knowing that every frame was a nail in the coffin of their ambition. By Wednesday afternoon, Darius had reached a new level of public arrogance. I sat in Mr. Otis's kitchen and opened a social media application on my phone. There was Darius broadcasting a live video to hundreds of followers to promote what he called his urban renewal project. He titled the stream "Transforming a Ghetto Relic into Luxury Gold." He walked through the parlor floor with his camera phone held high, mocking every detail that my father had loved. He sneered at the hand-painted floral wallpaper, calling it a grandmother's nightmare. He ran his hand over the curved banister of the grand oak staircase, telling his audience that this old, heavy wood was outdated and made the space feel like a funeral parlor. He promised his viewers that by next week, all of this history would be in a dumpster. The climax of his video came when he reached the main fireplace. This was the crown jewel of the house, a hand-carved Italian marble masterpiece that my father Elijah had spent 3 years paying for and a month installing with surgical precision. It was the place where we hung our stockings every Christmas and where Pop sat to read his newspapers. Darius stood in front of it and tapped the marble with a heavy metal ring on his finger. He looked into the lens and laughed, telling everyone that this gaudy rock was the first thing that would be demolished to create a wide-open space for a modern living room. He said that real luxury meant forgetting the past and embracing a clean, white future. He was not just renovating a house, he was gleefully announcing his intent to erase the soul of our family. I watched the screen as my hands began to tremble with a primal rage. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but I did not let the anger cloud my judgment. I leaned forward and pressed the screen recording button on my phone, making sure every word and every mocking gesture was captured in high definition. I watched as the little red recording icon blinked, documenting his confession for the entire world to see. I whispered to the empty room that he should keep laughing and keep talking. I told the image of his face on my screen that he was currently filming the very evidence that would lead to his own ruin. He was so blinded by his own vanity that he was hand-delivering me the weapon I needed to destroy his career and his freedom. Monday morning arrived with a violent roar that shook the very foundations of the block. I stood behind the curtains at the home of Mr. Otis and felt the vibrations of industrial drills echoing through the pavement. It was barely 8 o'clock in the morning, but the destruction was already in full swing. I watched with a bleeding heart as 2 laborers emerged from my front door carrying splintered remains of the mahogany banister. They tossed the historic wood into a metal bin like it was common kindling. Then I saw Darius. He stepped onto the parlor floor wearing a bright yellow hard hat that looked like a toy on his head. He was holding a heavy 10-pound sledgehammer, posing for Portia as she angled her phone to capture the perfect shot for his social media followers. He swung the hammer with a reckless grin, slamming it into the side of the Italian marble fireplace. The sound of stone cracking felt like a bone breaking in my own body. White dust exploded into the air, coating his expensive suit and filling the room with a ghostly haze. This was the golden moment I had been waiting for. The second his hammer shattered that marble, he moved from being a nuisance to a criminal. I picked up my phone with steady hands and made 3 precise calls. First, I dialed the Department of Buildings to report major structural demolition being conducted without permits or licensed contractors. Second, I called the local precinct to report an active case of breaking and entering and the felony destruction of property belonging to an irrevocable trust. Finally, I called Attorney Thurgood. I only needed to say 4 words to him, which were "It is time to start." I did not wait for his reply. I put my phone in my pocket and stood up straight, smoothing out the wrinkles in my wool coat. I picked up a thick leather briefcase containing the original trust documents, the deed, and the printed evidence of the illegal sale. I looked at Mr. Otis, who gave me a solemn nod of encouragement. I walked out of his house and stepped into the cool morning air, crossing the street with a deliberate and unhurried pace. Every step I took toward my father's house felt like reclaiming a piece of my soul. I arrived at the foot of my own stairs just as the distant wail of sirens began to fill the air, signaling the end of their short and greedy reign. The quiet dignity of Jefferson Avenue was shattered by the sudden wail of sirens as 2 patrol cars and a city building inspector vehicle screeched to a halt in front of the brownstone. Blue and red lights flashed against the historic stone walls, drawing neighbors onto their stoops to witness the commotion. Darius came charging out of the front door, his expensive suit jacket covered in a fine layer of white marble dust and his face contorted with rage. He began shouting at the officers, demanding to know what they were doing at his private property and claiming that he was the rightful owner. Behind him, Genevieve rushed out onto the landing, her voice reaching a shrill peak as she pointed a finger at me. She screamed that I was a bitter woman who was only trying to interfere because I could not handle being kicked out. The building inspector did not say a word as he walked past them and slapped a bright orange sticker directly onto the center of the oak door. It was a stop work order, a legal blockade that signaled the end of their unauthorized destruction. The police sergeant stepped forward and asked Darius to provide legal proof of his ownership of the premises. Darius confidently reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, which was nothing more than a handwritten agreement between him and Genevieve for the sale of the house. I chose that exact moment to step into the circle of light. I opened my briefcase and handed the sergeant a heavy gold-sealed document. It was the certified deed of trust, clearly stating that the property was owned by the Elijah Vance Irrevocable Trust and managed solely by me as the trustee. The sergeant reviewed the papers for a long moment before looking at Darius with a cold and professional gaze. He told Darius that the handwritten contract was completely worthless because Genevieve did not have the legal authority to sell even a single brick of the house. He informed Darius that he was currently being cited for the criminal destruction of property belonging to a legal trust. Genevieve turned pale, her mouth hanging open as she realized the floor was vanishing beneath her feet. I looked her directly in the eye and spoke with a voice that was as sharp as a razor. I told her to look at Section 4 of the trust agreement. By permitting Darius to destroy the structural integrity and the original craftsmanship of the home, she had violated the core conditions of her residency. I informed her that her life estate was officially terminated at this very second. She was no longer a resident, but a trespasser in my father's house. The scene on the sidewalk turned into a theater of the absurd as the police sergeant issued a final order for everyone to vacate the premises immediately. He announced that the brownstone was now a sealed crime scene pending a full investigation into the structural damage and the fraudulent sale. Genevieve collapsed onto the stone steps, wailing at the top of her lungs and wiping fake tears from her cheeks. She began a desperate performance, crying out to the gathering crowd that I was a cold and heartless stepdaughter who was throwing a grieving widow onto the streets. She tried to catch the eyes of the long-time residents, hoping to stir up the collective communal sympathy that had defined this block for decades. But the neighborhood did not bend to her theatrics. I looked past her and saw Mr. Otis standing with several other elders of the community, their arms folded tightly across their chests. They did not offer a hand of comfort or a word of support. They simply watched with stern and knowing faces, shaking their heads in silent disapproval. These were the people who had watched my father spend 30 years sweating over the details of this house. They knew who had cherished the history of the block, and they knew who had brought in sledgehammers to destroy it for a quick profit. To them, Genevieve was not a victim. She was a vandal who had finally been caught. Darius looked as though he had seen a ghost. His arrogant swagger had vanished, replaced by a sickly pale complexion that made him look small and pathetic. The weight of his financial ruin was visibly crushing him. He had secretly borrowed $600,000 from high-interest private lenders to pay Genevieve in cash, believing he could flip the house and pay them back within months. Now he realized he had handed over a fortune for a house he did not own, and he was facing felony charges that would strip him of his professional license forever. He was a predator who had finally been snared in a much more sophisticated trap. Portia was equally useless, sitting on a pile of black garbage bags and sobbing uncontrollably. Her tears were not for her mother or for the loss of our family home. She was crying because the officers refused to let her back inside to retrieve her designer handbags and her expensive jewelry. She was terrified of the life of struggle that was waiting for her outside the gates of my father's legacy. As the officers began to escort them away from the property, I felt no joy, only the deep and quiet satisfaction of a debt finally being paid in full. 3 months later, the cold marble of the courthouse stood as a silent witness to the final act of this tragedy. I sat behind Attorney Thurgood as the full extent of the financial rot was exposed to the light. The $600,000 that Darius had handed over to Genevieve in that illegal transaction had completely evaporated. She had not been the victim of a scam or a bad investment, as she had tried to claim in her early depositions. The bank records revealed a much uglier truth. Genevieve had spent every single penny in a frantic burst of vanity and greed. She had purchased a white luxury car for Portia, booked first-class vacations to tropical islands, and quietly settled thousands of dollars in old gambling debts that she had hidden from my father for years. The judge looked at Genevieve with a disgust that was visible to everyone in the room. The final judgment was a devastating blow to their house of cards. The court issued a permanent eviction order banning Genevieve and Portia from ever setting foot on the property again. Darius fared even worse. The judge stripped him of his real estate broker license for life and ordered him to pay a massive financial penalty specifically designated for the restoration of the Italian marble fireplace. He left the courtroom in handcuffs, facing criminal charges for his role in the fraud. They had tried to steal a legacy, but they ended up with nothing but the bitter taste of their own choices. The sky over Brooklyn broke open once again, mirroring the violent storm from the night I was first locked out of my own life. I sat in the warmth of the parlor, listening to the rhythmic hum of the rain against the glass and the crackle of the fire in the newly restored hearth. Suddenly, the sharp chime of the doorbell echoed through the hallway. I leaned forward and activated the security monitor. Through the camera lens, I saw Genevieve and Portia standing on the sidewalk looking small and defeated. Their expensive clothes were ruined and soaked through, and they each clutched a single battered suitcase. They looked into the camera with desperate eyes, sobbing and pleading for the sake of family and for a warm place to sleep for just one night. I looked at their faces and felt nothing but a quiet, immovable clarity. I pressed the intercom button, and my voice rang out steady and cold into the rainy night. I told them that when they threw my father's portraits and his legacy out into the rain, they made a choice to stand in that rain forever. I informed them that this house was the sacred sanctuary of the Elijah Vance line, and it had no room for those who brought nothing but betrayal and destruction. I did not wait for a response or a second plea. I simply turned off the monitor and watched the screen fade to black, leaving them to the cold darkness they had earned for themselves. 1 year has passed since the shadows were lifted from this brownstone. The air inside the house no longer smells of dust and betrayal, but of lemon oil and fresh tea. Every inch of the parlor has been meticulously restored to its original glory. The mahogany banister shines under the warm glow of the chandelier, and the Italian marble fireplace stands proud, once again rebuilt piece by piece as a testament to our resilience. I sat by the hearth with Mr. Otis, watching the amber flames dance in the grate. Above us, a large oil painting of my father Elijah looked down with a soft and approving smile. This house has transformed into something much greater than a residence. It is now a sanctuary and a consulting office where I help other families in our community protect their generational wealth and legal inheritances from those who seek to steal them. I have realized that peace is not a matter of luck or a gift from the universe. It is a hard-won reward for those who possess the patience to wait and the courage to fight when the time is right. My father built these walls with his hands, but I have fortified them with the law and my own unshakable spirit. We are not just preserving a building, we are guarding the soul of our history. As I sipped my tea and listened to Mr. Otis tell stories of the old days, I knew that the legacy of Elijah Vance was finally safe. The doors are closed to the vultures, but they remain wide open for the people who understand the true value of home.